December 5, 1945. Fort Lauderdale, Florida. 5 Navy bombers take off into a clear afternoon sky on a routine training flight. 14 men on board. 2 hours later, one of those men will radio a message that still gives pilots chills 2 years later. We are entering whitewater. Nothing looks right. We don't know where we are. Then silence. Not one of those 5 planes was ever found. Not one body. Not one piece of wreckage. And here's the part that nobody talks about: the rescue plane sent to find them vanished too. With 13 more men aboard. In front of witnesses who watched it explode over the ocean. 27 men. 6 aircraft. Gone in a single afternoon. Inside the triangle of water between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico that the US Navy itself could never fully explain. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why this case is still officially listed as cause unknown and why some investigators think the real explanation is scarier than any sea monster or vortex theory ever could be. Let's go back to that Wednesday afternoon. Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station was a training hub for the US Navy, churning out young pilots for war that had technically just ended 4 months earlier. Flight 19 was supposed to be simple, a standard overweight navigation exercise. The kind of mission student pilots ran almost every week. 5 Tim Avenger torpedo bombers. The same kind of plane George W. Bush had flown during the war. The route was a triangle. Fly east over the ocean. Turn north. Then head back southwest to base. 90 minutes. Tops. 14 men climbed into those cockpits that day. Under manning command was Lieutenant Charles Taylor, a combat-experienced flight instructor with over 2,500 hours in the air. If anyone was equipped to bring these young men home safely, it was him. But here's the detail almost nobody mentions in the popular retellings. The one that changes everything about how you should think about this case. Charles Taylor had just transferred to Fort Lauderdale. He'd flown missions in the Pacific. Sure, but he had almost no experience navigating this specific stretch of Atlantic water, with its unique chain of small islands that all looked eerily similar from the air. And that afternoon, something else was working against him. His compass. Taylor would later be recorded, mid-flight, telling his student pilots that both of his compasses had failed. Not one, both. In an era before GPS, before satellite tracking, a pilot without a working compass over open ocean was flying blind in the truest sense. Around 3:40 p.m., air traffic control at Fort Lauderdale picked up a radio transmission from another student pilot relaying Taylor's words. "I don't know where we are. We must have gotten lost after that last turn." A flight instructor. Lost. 40 minutes into a 90-minute training run. And it was about to get so much worse. Here's where the story takes the turn that historians still argue about. Believing his compasses were broken, Taylor made a call. He decided he was over the Gulf of Mexico, not the Atlantic, and that he needed to fly northeast to find Florida. But if he was actually where the Navy believes he was, off the coast of the Bahamas, over the Atlantic, flying northeast would take his squadron further out to sea, not closer to land. One of his junior pilots, a man named Captain Edward Powers, reportedly disagreed with him over the radio, suggesting they fly west instead, toward the setting sun and the mainland. Taylor overruled him. He was the commanding officer. His word was final. And so 5 planes, carrying 14 men, turned away from safety and flew deeper into open water as the afternoon light began to fade. What happened over the next hour would turn a training exercise into one of the most chilling mysteries in aviation history. What makes Flight 19 different from most disappearance stories is that we don't have to imagine the fear, we have it recorded. Ground control was in intermittent contact with the squadron for nearly 2 hours, and the transcripts are haunting. At one point Taylor can be heard saying, "We are heading 030 degrees for 45 minutes. Then we will fly north to make sure we are not over the Gulf of Mexico." Minutes later, Confusion again. We didn't fly far enough east. We may just as well just head due east. The planes were also, by this point, running low on fuel. A Tim Avenger carried enough for about 4 hours in the air. And they had already been flying for nearly 3. Ground control tried repeatedly to get a fix on their position using radio direction finding equipment. But atmospheric interference and Taylor's own scattered instructions made it almost impossible. And then, at 4:45 p.m., controllers heard something that made everyone in that radio room go still. Taylor's voice came through the static. And it wasn't the voice of a man giving orders anymore. Witnesses in the control room described it as shaken. He reported the ocean below looked strange, describing what pilots call white water. A visual effect where the sea and sky seemed to blend into a featureless white haze near sunset, making it almost impossible to judge altitude, direction, or even which way was up. "It looks like we are entering white water," he said. "We're completely lost." Weather reports from that evening confirmed conditions were deteriorating. Fast rising winds, churning seas, and a squall line moving inexactly along their presumed flight path. 5 planes, low on fuel, with a commander who admittedly couldn't trust his own instruments, now flying through worsening weather as daylight ran out. At 6:20 p.m., the last confirmed transmission ever received from Flight 19 came through the radio. And what it said sent chills through everyone listening. The final message, gobbled and fragmented, appeared to be Taylor preparing the squadron to ditch to bring the planes down together in the ocean once fuel ran out completely, so that if any of them survived, they'd survive as a group. After that, nothing. Total radio silence. Sunset in Fort Lauderdale that day was at 5:29 p.m. By the time of that final transmission, the 5 Avengers had been flying in darkness, over rough seas, for nearly an hour, almost certainly out of fuel or seconds from it. Search and rescue was scrambled immediately, and this is where the story stops being just a tragedy and starts becoming something the Navy still can't fully explain. Because the rescue effort was about to suffer a loss of its own, one that happened in full view of multiple witnesses. At 7:27 p.m., a MPN Mariner flying boat took off from Naval Air Station Banana River with a crew of 13 men, tasked with searching the last known area and watching for flares or wreckage. The Mariner was nicknamed, almost too fittingly, a flying gas tank by the men who flew them because they were notorious for fuel vapor buildup in the cabin that could ignite from a single spark. 23 minutes after takeoff, the SS Gaines Mills, a tanker ship in the area, reported seeing the burst of flame on the horizon, followed by a fire burning on the water's surface for several minutes. The Mariner never checked in again. It had almost certainly exploded mid-air. 13 more men gone, in an instant, while trying to save the 14 who we already lost. By the end of that night, the death toll from a routine Tuesday training flight stood at 27. What followed was staggering. Over the next 5 days, the US Navy and Coast Guard launched more than 300 aircraft and multiple ships, combing nearly 250,000 square miles of ocean and land, an area larger than the state of Texas. They searched the presumed flight path, the Bahamas, the Florida coastline, everywhere a life raft or wreckage might have drifted. They found absolutely nothing. Not a single piece of debris from 5 Avenger bombers. Not an oil slick. Not a life vest. Not a scrap of a wing. For context, when a plane crashes into the ocean, it typically leaves behind a debris field, floating seat cushions, fuel slicks, pieces of the fuselage. Finding literally nothing from 5 separate aircraft is, statistically, almost unheard of. The Navy's official report on the incident would go on to include a line that has fueled conspiracy theories for 80 years. And once you hear it, you'll understand why. The Navy's Board of Investigation closed its file on Flight 19 with the official verdict: cause unknown. Not pilot error. Not mechanical failure. Not weather. Unknown. Taylor's mother would later fight for years to have that verdict changed, arguing the Navy was unfairly blaming her son. And in 1947 the Navy did technically shift the classification to pilot error, but even then, the official documentation admitted investigators still couldn't explain the complete absence of wreckage, or why a trained, combat-experienced pilot would make such fundamental navigational mistakes in the first place. This gap between what should have happened and what actually happened is exactly the kind of gap that turns a tragedy into a legend, and it's why, just a few years later, a journalist would coin a phrase that changed how the entire world thought about this stretch of ocean. The Navy's Board of Investigation closed its file on Flight 19 with the official verdict: cause unknown. Not pilot error. Not mechanical failure. Not weather. Unknown. Taylor's mother would later fight for years to have that verdict changed, arguing the Navy was unfairly blaming her son. And in 1947 the Navy did technically shift the classification to pilot error, but even then, the official documentation admitted investigators still couldn't explain the complete absence of wreckage, or why a trained, combat-experienced pilot would make such fundamental navigational mistakes in the first place. This gap between what should have happened and what actually happened is exactly the kind of gap that turns a tragedy into a legend, and it's why, just a few years later, a journalist would coin a phrase that changed how the entire world thought about this stretch of ocean. In 1950, an Associated Press reporter named Edward Van Winkle Jones wrote an article connecting Flight 19 to a string of other unexplained disappearances in the same general region, ships and planes that had vanished without a trace over the decades. A few years later, in 1964, writer Vincent Gaddis published an article that gave this stretch of ocean its now famous name: the Bermuda Triangle. Roughly bounded by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, the theory claimed dozens of ships and aircraft had disappeared inside this zone under circumstances that defied normal explanation. Flight 19 became the Triangle's founding leg and the case that started it all. But here's what almost never makes it into the documentaries. The detail that skeptics say is the real key to the entire mystery. Aviation researchers who've spent years going through the original Navy transcripts point out something crucial. Taylor's confusion may not have been supernatural at all, it may have been a textbook case of what's called spatial disorientation, combined with a genuinely broken compass, worsening weather, and a stubborn refusal to hand over command to a junior pilot who had a better read on their position. As for the missing wreckage, the presumed crash zone lies over some of the roughest, deepest water off the Bahamas, with strong currents capable of scattering debris across hundreds of miles within days, and depths where 1,940s research equipment simply couldn't reach. The Mariner explosion, tragic as it was, had a known mechanical cause. Those planes had a documented history of vapor explosions. Case closed, according to the skeptics. Except for one detail that even the most hardened deck nukers have never been able to fully explain. Radar operators tracking the squadron that evening reported something strange in their logs. Intermittent instrument malfunctions in the area consistent with Taylor's compass failure, not just on his plane, but described as affecting multiple aircraft in the flight. Modern researchers have proposed one compelling, non-supernatural theory. This exact region sits near an area where magnetic north and true north diverge in an unusual way. One of the few places on Earth where an uncorrected compass reading can lead a pilot dangerously astray without them even realizing it. It's a real, documented phenomenon, not magic. Not a vortex, but it means that on the one day it mattered most, in the one place it mattered most, Taylor's instruments may have been quietly lying to him from the very first turn. A small, invisible error, compounding minute after minute, until 14 men were lost over darkening water with no way back. And that brings us to the question that still haunts everyone who studies this case. Historians who've mapped out the squadron's radioed positions have run the numbers, and their conclusion is almost unbearable. If Taylor had listened to Captain Powers and turned the squadron west, toward the sun, toward Florida, multiple analyses suggest they very likely would have reached land with fuel to spare before nightfall. One decision, made under pressure, by an experienced man trusting a broken instrument over his own junior officer's instincts, is what separates this from being a forgotten Tuesday in 1945 and becoming one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American history. 27 men died that night not because of sea monsters, not because of time portals, but because of a compass, a coastline that looked the same in every direction, and a chain of small human decisions that could never be undone once the sun went down. And that's the part of this story that should genuinely disturb you. Because if you strip away the legend, the Bermuda Triangle myth, the ghost stories, what you are left with is something far more unsettling than the supernatural. It's proof that in 1945, with all the training, all the technology, all the protocols the US Navy could offer, 27 men could simply vanish from the face of the earth in a matter of hours. And even the most powerful search operation in naval history could find absolutely nothing. No wreckage has ever been confirmed. No black box, because there wasn't one. To this day, deep-sea explorers occasionally claim to have located Avenger wrecks off the Florida coast, only for later dives to prove they belong to entirely different planes, lost in entirely different accidents, as if the ocean is almost taunting the searchers, offering false hope again and again. Flight 19 remains exactly where the Navy left it in 1945. Cause unknown. So the next time someone tells you the Bermuda Triangle is just a myth, remember this: the United States military itself, with all its resources, never fully closed this case. And if you want to know about the disappearance that came next, the one where an entire ship's crew vanished mid-voyage, leaving a fully cooked meal still warm on the table, make sure you're subscribed. Because that story is coming next. And it's even harder to explain.